All right, let's get started. No reason to wait. So good evening. This is the LaRouche Pack Saturday evening class series, part of a four-part class series with Bruce Director. I'm your host and I guess moderator, Mike Stager. And just want to welcome everyone to the discussion tonight. We know these are the long summer days, so we appreciate you taking time out on Saturdays to sit down and take into consideration not just the immediate political events that are ongoing, which there are a number of aspects. And I think Bruce is going to touch on some of the strategic perspective tonight, but also to recognize that if we're going to address the deep problems that our nation and really our civilization face, it's going to come from a consideration of equality of ideas, equality of thought that has built our society, built our civilization, but has been neglected in terms of policy, in terms of long-term policy setting programs for way, way too long. So I think we were just talking before the event started tonight. As people know, there's an ongoing buildup to expose the election fraud in the 2020 election. It stands at this point that November 3rd will be looked back upon as a kind of Pearl Harbor event on the American political system, and that the American people responded as they did with Pearl Harbor, where the kind of staid and recalcitrant response that people had to real politics, not just party politics or elections, but an engagement in the deep corruption of the culture, from education to the bureaucracies, the police state, the banking, that people have now revolted and said, enough's enough. We're going to take back the nation in our own hands, from school boards to the presidency. We're going to get involved and run the country. And that's starting with the election integrity fight. So Arizona the report as reported looks to be substantial and will take weeks before it's even produced. It's already inspired because of a number of state legislators who have passed through there, increasing provocations in Georgia. There's more and more news every day out of Fulton County. There are fights in Michigan. And there's a lot of resistance, not surprisingly, from real entrenched treasonous rhinos in the state houses, Raffensperger in Georgia, state legislators in Michigan or Pennsylvania, a lot of corporatist pressure, a lot of establishment, Silicon Valley pressure on these so-called politicians. But what we need to get rid of is politicians. We need to recreate a real generation of leadership. You see the same thing with the police state operations. There was exposure this past week, and I know LaRouche Pack and Barbara Board are going to have more to say on this on the January 6th event, how the FBI was involved. But this is a long-term trend going back decades that the LaRouche organization, LaRouche Pack, knows very well. So we'll continue to help expose that, but you see a building up within the American people. You also saw the Putin-Biden summit. I know Bruce is going to touch on that, so I'm going to leave that for him. And just welcome people into a discussion where you're starting to see the American people fight. And I think Lyndon LaRouche would agree wholeheartedly that the missing ingredient for these last number of decades has been the engagement of the American people at a true level of citizenry. And that's what we have today. And so for us, it's now a deliberation on the quality of ideas and the most effective approach towards this kind of revolutionary moment to reassert our constitutional system. So with that, Bruce, I'm going to kick it off to you, let you take it away and give us a sense of what you're thinking.
Okay, well, that's good. So last week we talked about the kinds of ideas we need to be able to think about how we navigate the world out of the current crisis. Tonight, we're going to talk about how to survey the situation, survey the territory, so that we know exactly what we're navigating through. Now, I'm using these kinds of metaphors, navigation and surveying, to convey the idea of the kind of thinking that's required to really understand what's happening with the political and economic situation, but also what kind of thinking is necessary to be able to come up with solutions for it. But they're not simply metaphors. In fact, the actual skills required for navigation and surveying are quite essential prerequisites for political leadership. And I don't think it's just an accident of history that some of our greatest political leaders in the United States and some of the greatest scientists throughout history actually had experience as surveyors. I guess most people know. If you don't, you haven't been really taught American history very much, but George Washington's main occupation, aside from being a farmer, prior to becoming a military and political leader and founder of the United States, was as a surveyor. He surveyed the entire area of the Virginia plantations and colonies, which implied not just the area that today people think of as Virginia, but also West Virginia. And the area from which I'm speaking, Northern Virginia, was all mapped out by Washington, which included not just measuring various parcels of land, but actually determining the nature of the terrain, which is essential if you're trying to develop concepts for being able to change it and develop it and conquer it. Abraham Lincoln worked as a surveyor. Lyndon LaRouche, in his early years, in the period leading up to World War II, was involved in the U.S. Geodesic Survey, which was part of the whole development program that Roosevelt was involved in. If you're fortunate enough to have run across this, Roosevelt was committed to actually surveying the entire land area of the United States. And if you know where to look, you'll find markers that were planted by the U.S. Geodesic Survey all over the country, marking the latitude, longitude, and elevation, which are the key markers for mapping still to this day. And LaRouche spent many months, I don't know exactly how many, but he spent many months throughout the mountains of West Texas and New Mexico, measuring and surveying these areas and locating these markers. Gauss, the great physicist, mathematician, scientific thinker who really laid the foundation for much of modern science and modern physics, including theory of relativity and so forth, spent many years doing a survey of the area of Hanover in Germany. And out of his work came the development of his theory of surfaces and his general ideas of a manifold. So surveying involves actually being able to determine the characteristics of the terrain. And in the case of a physical survey, a land survey, you're not measuring the land that you're standing on. You're actually measuring and surveying the characteristics of the gravitational field of the Earth, because the survey is done by dropping a plumb bob, which points towards the pull of gravity, and then leveling your surveying device, which involves a very complex physical process, out of which the idea of complex numbers comes from, by the way, and then measuring angles along the surface and angles of inclination. So you're actually measuring light and gravity, or in effect, the electromagnetic field and the gravitational field and variations on that, not the physical world in which you think you're actually looking at. And that, I think, is a very good point, because the world, the things that appear to be the most firm to you, such as the ground under your feet, is really not is not reality. That what is reality are the physical processes that are affecting you, and that actually are governing the way you are oriented with respect to what appear to be the solid physical objects. I'll give you an example of that, or an expression of that, from recent developments. You take the recent summit between Biden and Putin, and compare that to the summit between Trump and Putin several years ago. Two summits, same thing, President of the United States, President of Russia. The Putin-Trump summit drew a complete freak out on the part of the establishment, was considered to be the worst thing that could possibly happen, was attacked in the media, it was ridiculed, and every effort was made on the part of the U.S. establishment, the British Empire, what some people call the globalist elite, or whatever name you want to give to it, but it really is the British Empire, to prevent any initiatives that were agreed to by Trump and Putin in that summit from ever coming into existence. And compare that to the Biden summit, and all of a sudden, the President of the United States meeting with the President of Russia is a good thing, reduces tensions, and so on and so forth. Now, you may think that the reason for this is what is on the surface. That is, the media and the establishment hates Trump. They love Biden. So therefore, everything Biden does is okay, and everything Trump does is not okay. That's not true. That has nothing to do with it. That's the surface. That's the hard ground under your feet. That's what's in front of your nose, but that's not what's really governing things. The key difference between the two summits is that the principle on which they were occurring. The Trump-Putin summit was based on two sovereign nations discussing and meeting on how to orient their own relationship relative to each other, as well as relative to other sovereign nations. And that was possible because Trump had asserted asserted that the United States was going to return to what George Washington had said the United States was supposed to be, a sovereign independent nation that avoided foreign entanglements and defended its own sovereignty and fought for its own development. Now, that doesn't mean we withdraw from the world, but it means we orient towards other countries from the standpoint that they have the same interest, which is as sovereign nations to defend their own development and to then come to mutual agreements about how to about how to progress in a terrain, in an environment that is based on the principle of sovereignty. The Biden-Trump summit occurred on a completely different principle. Biden laid it out several times. He goes first to the G7 meeting and then to the NATO meeting, and he says the US is back. Back to what? Back to being a part of the British Empire. Then he states in his press conferences that the issue is, in the world today, is a conflict between democracy and autocracy. And that the United States, Biden was representing not the United States as a sovereign nation, but representing the democracies of the world, a democratic bloc, and that Putin was an autocracy. And he represents a bloc of autocrats, of which he'd include anybody, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, whatever. Now, Trump looked at it completely differently. These were sovereign countries, and the US was a sovereign country, and these countries were going to have to deal with the United States as a sovereign nation. And that is a completely different environment. I mean, and Biden is absolutely lying because, first of all, the United States is not a democracy. It's a republic. The democracy, in a certain sense, well, Plato called it the closest thing to a dictatorship. And our founding fathers feared democracy as the next step to a dictatorship. The democracy is not a sovereign nation organized by the people, or as Lincoln said, by the people, for the people, of the people. It's an autocracy, really, that is part of an imperial system, i.e. the British Empire, or what you want to call it, globalization. The British, after they could no longer maintain colonies as a military and political establishment, shifted into this idea of globalization, a financial empire, which they were before, but they dropped the pretense of actual governing colonies into this idea of globalization. But it was an imperial system, and the imperial system rules on the basis of the oligarchy stating what they want the will of the people to be, not what the people themselves decide, and organize representative governments, as we've been presenting in these linking series, but a mythical will of the people. Hitler ruled through the will of the people. And this is what you see happening now. Biden has said this is the politics of the United States, is between, quote, democracy, which is not, which in his view and his implementation and the policies that he is part of, is an actual dictatorship done in the name of the will of the people, without the people being involved in determining what that is. So this whole myth about blocks of autocracies and blocks of democracies is just a falsehood. It's a false way of stating that the issue here is the establishment, the United States, according to Biden, is re-entering the British Empire. And so the media and the establishment were all happy about the Biden summit with Putin, because it was falsely, and this is an illusion on Biden's part and their part, a attempt to reassert the power of the empire. Now, that may appear to be a very small difference and not something that is necessarily apparent in terms of the visible and specific elements there, but is that crucial difference, which is actually tells you what is actually going on here. The other, of course, illusion is that these blocks exist, like for Biden to say, we represent the coalition of democracies. Well, there's no coalition of democracies. As Trump said repeatedly, the Europeans were worse than China with respect to the United States on trade. And the whole conflicts that Trump had with the Europeans were justified conflicts because the Europeans, in holding up some idea that the United States has to be aligned with them for democracy, were actually being used by the British Empire to actually disadvantage the United States economically. And Trump says that that game's gone out the window. Like, you take the whole existence of NATO. NATO was created ostensibly as a bulwark military alliance against supposedly the Soviet Union. But of course, the founders of NATO actually, the honest ones would say, no, the purpose of NATO is to keep the Russians out and the Germans down. But the Soviet Union disappeared in 1990. Why do we still have NATO? NATO has no meaning anymore, except in the minds of Biden and the British and so forth, as a way to keep the United States engaged in foreign entanglements that George Washington warned about, that do not concern the United States self-interest. So when Trump went with Putin, he wasn't meeting him as a representative of other countries in some ridiculous alliance, which has no meaning anymore. Trump was meeting with Putin on the as the president of the United States, a sovereign republic, not like Biden, who was there as the functionary of an imperial system and trying to discuss with Putin how Russia should orient itself with respect to this reestablishment of this imperial system. Okay, we could go into a lot of details about that, and we're going to be having an article on the LaRouche PAC website, which will deal with that. But I wanted to just summarize it because I wanted you to think about what is the actual way of thinking which is at work here. And that is that you have to learn that there are principles at work which really define the terrain, the territory, or what Gauss's student Bernard Riemann would call the manifold of action in which things are taking place. And you have to always ask that question: what is the manifold of action that in which things are taking place, to be able to understand what's happening? That's the surveying part. And out of the surveying part, you develop, if you have the concepts of what you're trying to create, to navigate your way into the future. We'll get into more specifics about that over the next two classes, but that's where we're at right now. How do we understand how do we discover the manifold of action? Now, as I said last week, and I'll repeat it again this week, you have to train your mind to think this way. Now, if you look at the history of science, all the way back from the ancient Greeks and ancient Egyptians, up through the development of modern times, the development of ideas of Einstein, of Vernadsky, and even newer ideas that are emerging at this very moment. The method of thinking that is universal to all great scientific discoveries, all meaningful scientific discoveries, is really all based on this question of being able to look beyond the domain of sense perceptions and conceptualize the manifold of action and define within that manifold of action the potential of action, and then identifying how that expresses itself. I gave a brief example about Kepler, and I've done that before in other presentations. LaRouche emphasized that if you're not a scientist who's working on some of these questions, but you want to be a competent citizen who can understand politics and economics and so forth, you have to develop this quality of mind that a scientist has in making discoveries of physical science. And so if you acquaint yourself with some of these great discoveries and paradoxes and see how they work, you will not be able to directly apply them in some type of formula way, but you will be able to train your mind in how to think about how to approach some of these matters which you're trying to deal with as a political person. But this is not just limited to science. LaRouche also emphasized that this is true also with art. And next week, we're going to, with the assistance of Miwa Steger, show you how that works with respect to music. But tonight I want to continue using scientific examples to try and develop, or at least acquaint you with this idea. So let's start with developing first the idea of a manifold of action. Now, this is a very big idea and has a lot of aspects to it, and you can approach it from many different ways. But I want to give you a simple example to just illustrate, acquaint you with how you think about these things. So Mike, if you could put up the first slide of reflection. So this is a simple idea, a simple expression of reflection, where you can see the green laser is bouncing off of a reflective surface and then bouncing back. Now, this is not you don't need a laser to do this. You can do this yourself. You probably do it every morning when you look in the mirror. You see a reflection. And the reason why you see a reflection is because the light is from your eye, or the light is from the objects that you see in the mirror is reflected off the mirror into your eye. And you're very accustomed to this, and you notice that the light, the objects that you see in the mirror have the same orientation relative to each other that they do in the room around you. And this is because, as you can see with this laser, the angle at which the light hits the mirror, that's called the angle of incidence, and the angle of reflection, and that's the angle the light makes with the mirror as it reflects, are both equal. Now, you can do this experiment yourself by looking at an object in the mirror and then holding a string between your eye and the place where you see the object in the mirror, measuring that angle, and then putting the string from the image to the object and measuring that angle. And you'll do the same thing that we're illustrating here with respect to this laser. So this is not some big fancy experiment. In fact, the ancient Greeks figured this out, that the angle of incidence and the angle of reflection are the same. Now, that's a very interesting discovery, and you could write that down as a mathematical formula. Angle of incidence equals angle of reflection. So, but that's not, so that's just a formula which just describes what you see. What's actually going on here? You could pose the question this way: why is the angle of incidence and the angle of reflection equal? Why does it work that way? Why is it not that the angle of incidence and the angle of reflection are two different values, either varying according to some proportion or varying arbitrarily? Well, of course, it would mean that images in the mirrors would be not really reflective of reality. But is there a principle which commands, in a sense, the two angles to be equal? Well, the ancient Greeks understood this, because the angle, by having the angle of incidence and the angle of reflection equal, the distance from your eye to the mirror, to the object, is the shortest possible physical distance. And you can confirm that yourself by doing that experiment with the strings that I said. So that's very interesting. Why does the light conform to a principle of shortest distance? That's an interesting question to think about and to let seep in what that says about the universe. It says that there's a principle here of what Leibniz later called least action that's being expressed here. That's the more general principle. So that there's an ordering principle in the universe. There's a manifold of action here of light moving through the air to the mirror, to your eye, that always seeks the shortest path. So the manifold of action there is the manifold in which light is propagating and reflecting, and it has a characteristic of the shortest path, the shortest distance. Now, let's go to the next one, Mike, of refraction. Okay, now this is, again, a laser doing something that appears complicated, which you are very familiar with, which is if you put a stick in a glass of water, the stick appears bent. Now you pull the stick out and the stick is straight, you put it in the water and it appears bent. So obviously the stick is not being bent by the water. What's happening is that the light is being bent. The light from the stick to your eye is coming to your eye from a different angle than the light from the stick to your eye in the air. And that's why it appears bent. So this is a laser which is illustrating that. You see the light coming in, I guess, from the right, and inside this container is some type of substance like water or something that reflects light, probably water with some particles in it. And when the light hits that, it bends a certain angle. And then when it gets to the end of the container there on the left, it has to bend again when it hits the air. So, but you notice that the angle at which the light, if you look at the angle, either one of those angles, where the light enters the container or where the light leaves the container, you'll notice that the angle of incidence, the angle at which the light hits the container, and the angle of refraction is not equal. So there's something different going on here than was happening under reflection. Now, this was a puzzle that took a long time for people to figure out. And it wasn't really solved until the 17th century by a French physicist and mathematician and philosopher and thinker named Pierre de Fermat. Some of you have probably heard of him. But what he discovered was that before him, it was discovered that the angle of incidence and the angle of refraction are not equal, but the sines of those angles are always in the same proportion relative to the medium. So that different media have refract light differently, but for any particular media, there's a specific proportion between the sines of the angles that stays the same. So the question Fermat solved is, well, what is it why are these, what's the purpose of, so to speak, of the angles, of the sines of the angles staying in the same proportion? And he showed that it was because the light was moving at a different speed in the air than it was in the medium, in the fluid, and therefore it slowed down. And the pathway, the total pathway of the light, was the pathway of shortest time. That this was the quickest way for the light to get from the air to the container and out of the container and back into the air. Now that tells you something very interesting, which is that the light knows that, how does the light know ahead of time what the shortest path it's going to be? And a lot of people objected to Fermat's idea because they said, well, how could the light know this? And he said, it's not that the light is conscious, but that there's a principle of nature of least action. And in this case, there's a change in speed. So unlike reflection, which is just a change in distance, in this case, you have a change in distance and speed, and that changes the least action pathway from least distance to least time. So another way to say this is that the manifold of action for reflection involves just distance, and the manifold of action for refraction involves distance and time. So the first example, in reflection, you could say that it's a one-dimensional manifold, one principal, distance, whereas the one parameter, whereas the manifold of refraction has two parameters, distance and time. So when the manifold has different numbers of principles, the pathway of action changes. The pathway of least action changes. So this introduces one idea, which was later generalized by Gauss and Riemann, and plays a very important role not only in modern physics, but also in LaRouche's understanding of economics, which is the idea of dimensionality of a manifold. Now, you're used to thinking of dimensions as you know, like a flat paper, a line is one-dimensional. Euclidean terms, a line is one-dimensional, a plane is two-dimensional, and a solid is three-dimensional. And then you talk about four dimensions, and people usually don't know what they're talking about. We'll say, well, that's Einstein's manifold of physical space-time. And where do you get to five? Well, you know, mathematicians can make up all kinds of formulas to add as many dimensions as you want. But you should forget all that. The main point is to think about the physical parameters that are acting. Okay, so that's the first concept you want to have from take from this, that you can then apply in understanding economics and politics, which is this idea of a manifold of action and the dimensionality of that manifold of action. Okay, that's fine for that. Now I want to introduce another concept that from physics and science, simple one. Actually, it's a very complex one. I'm going to introduce it in a very simple way, which is the question of curvature. Now, I spoke about this once before. I'll do it again and give you another example. But that's the difference between a flat plane, which is represented, say, by this piece of paper, and a sphere, which is represented by this semi-deflated ball. I'll just look at the part I'll squeeze it so it won't be deflated, and you can see that it's a sphere. Okay, or close to it. Now, there's a principle of curvature, which is that I can illustrate it simply, that I can roll this piece of paper up into a sphere, into a cylinder, and you can see that it has curvature in this direction, but not in this direction. But it's still a cylinder. You see the square I drew on it doesn't change. It's still there. But if I try and wrap this paper around the sphere, it doesn't work. The sphere has a different characteristic curvature. Now, this comes up in surveying, for example, because on a plane, a flat plane, and let me just say, both the flat surface and the sphere are really two-dimensional surfaces. When I'm speaking of the sphere, I'm not talking about the sphere and the inside of the sphere. I'm only talking about the surface. So if you think about the sphere, there are two dimensions, one in this direction and one in this direction. And the same thing with the plane. It's one in this direction and one in that direction. Okay. So they're both two-dimensional surfaces, but they have a distinguishing characteristic in that the surface of the plane has, as Gauss would say, has zero curvature, or in common language we would say is flat. And this surface is curved. And there are all kinds of variations with respect to curvature. This has uniform curvature because the sphere is curved in all directions, whereas you could take an object like a watermelon or something, and it's very flat up here, but very curved there. There's variations of curvature. As I said, this is a very long, very complex and beautiful subject, and Gauss wrote a lot on it, and we could do 50 classes on it, and you would never get tired of the discoveries. But I'm just going to leave it at that for now, at least in terms of, we're going to just use these simple examples. But one simple example that is very important in surveying is that a triangle on a sphere, on a flat plane, has the property that you learn in school, as long as you went to school before critical race theory and modern mathematics, that the sum of the angles of every triangle is 180 degrees. And no matter how big or small the triangles or what their shape is, if you add up their angles, they always equal 180 degrees. And that's a very important property because it gives you the ability to have similar triangles so that you can measure one triangle against another. If you know two of the angles, you can calculate what the third angle, and then measure the lengths as a function of the angles and so forth. And this is very important for surveying. However, if what you're measuring is not on a flat surface, but on a sphere, then the sum of the angles of a triangle are not always 180 degrees. In fact, they're never 180 degrees. It's always more than 180 degrees. If you just point to the North Pole and you go down to the equator and then over 90 degrees and then back up 90 degrees, you've drawn a triangle on the surface of a sphere, which is 270 degrees, much bigger than, and the size of the triangle on a sphere, the sum of the angles changes depending on the size of the triangle. So that's a much more complicated situation. This is something Gauss had to confront, because on the surface of the sphere, if it's a very, very large sphere and you're measuring a very small surface, small area of that, then the difference between the size of the triangles and the curvature, the effect of the curvature is so small that the difference would be beyond your measurement. And the way you do a survey of a large area is you measure one triangle and then you calculate the angles of other triangles connected to it, and you build up a grid of triangles. But the bigger you get, the more the curvature comes in to affect your measurements. So your measurements are made on smaller triangles in which the difference is smaller than your measuring devices can detect. And yet, as you connect these things, the curvature begins to have an influence, and so your measurements are off. So Gauss developed techniques and ideas about how to be able to figure out how to deal with that, or in other words, how to measure the changes in curvature in the very small. Now, this is a very important aspect of science, which is how to tell the effects of major processes, of very powerful processes that are affecting your situation, when their expression of it is very small. Going back to my example, our problem we're dealing with Biden versus Trump, the actual effect is in the large, the principle of empire versus sovereign republic. And yet, if you're trying to find the expression of that in the small, it can elude you if you don't have the ability to think like Gauss, to be able to come up with ways to determine how very, very small, even sometimes undetectable differences are the cause of major differences in principle. Okay, now let me give you another example of that with this simple illustration. Okay, so here's a square or some kind of rectangle drawn on this flat surface. I'll put it on this hard surface just to keep it stiff. And I'll run my marker along the edge of it without turning the marker. So I move it up, I move it over, I move it down, I move it along the side, and I come back to the same place. And you see the marker is pointing in the same direction. So I haven't turned the marker. I keep it pointing in the same direction. And all I do is move it around the perimeter of this sphere, of this flat surface. All right, now I'm going to try and illustrate this. And I'll ask you to look. I'll try and do it this way. My finger is the equivalent of the marker, okay? So I started moving in this direction. I move it up to here. I don't turn it. I move it down this direction. And then I move it back this way. And now I'm pointing in a different direction. I'll do it again. I start in this direction. I move it here. I move it that way. And I move it back here. And now I'm pointing in a different direction. I'm pointing at you where I started here. I'll try it again using this marker parallel, just so you maybe get the idea. I move it this way. I move it down. I move it back. And now I'm pointing in a different direction. I didn't turn the marker. The sphere did. Okay. So there's a characteristic of the curvature which can turn you around in a different direction. So if you don't know that you're moving on a curved surface versus a flat surface, or you're moving on a manifold which has a different type of curvature than the one you're imagining, you're going to end up in a different place. And if you just let your imagination run with you for a minute, you can see how this is very applicable to understanding physics and politics and economics, because you can easily misinterpret what's happening based on the wrong assumption about the curvature of the manifold. Now you have to really study Gauss a lot more. I've written a lot about this, and maybe at some future point we can do more detailed discussions about the concept of curvature, because it is very accessible to be able to figure out how to determine the global curvature from very, very small changes, which is what you need to do in politics and economics and in culture. For example, in history, for example, it's very small differences in certain decisions that are made in historical processes that lead to very large differences in outcomes, for example. Or in economics, you can think that you're building infrastructure to rebuild your physical economy, but if that infrastructure is in the wrong curvature, is interacting in a curvature that is not oriented towards increasing the productive powers of labor, then that so-called infrastructure you're building is not going to have the same effect as the investment in infrastructure, which increases the productive powers of labor. For example, the difference between building, I'm speaking off the top of my head here, just an expansion of the existing type of rail system we have in the United States, which may improve things to some degree here and there, but it's a far cry different than a maglev system for both passenger and freight powered by fusion power and so on and so forth. Those are two different curvatures. All right. Now the third, so we have two characteristics which we need to understand to understand politics and economics, and that's the dimensionality of our manifold of action and the curvature. And the third principle, which Riemann actually developed, is called connectivity. And that's how things are connected together. This is related to a more important idea, which I've spoken about before, and I will in the fourth class more, this question of potential. And connectivity and potential are very closely associated ideas, because if you have if things have a greater connectivity, then they have a greater potential for development. Now I illustrate this metaphorically, as Riemann did, with respect to geometrical shapes. Mike, you can put the slide up with the three objects. There you go. Okay, so you can see on this, there's I have them labeled just transcendentals for reasons which we're not going to go into tonight. But you can see that you have the spherical object there, which I call simple transcendental, and that's very simply connected. That is, to go from one point to another, there's really only one pathway to get there. But if you look at the one I measured elliptical, you have an object which has a hole in it. And in that case, there are actually two ways to get anywhere on that object. One is around the outside, and the other is going through the hole, right? So if you're at a point on the outside of the donut, you can get to that, you can draw a pathway around the outside, or you can draw a pathway through the hole. So there are two pathways that are possible on this type of figure. And ironically, the sphere, we were talking about curvature, the sphere has one curvature, whereas this elliptical curve, this torus, has two curvatures. The outside is positively curved and the inside is negatively curved. And then if you go to the last picture, I don't know if you can see that because of at least on my screen, the object, the image of me might be blocking it, but there are two holes. It's sort of a donut with two holes, kind of like a pretzel. And that has an increased connectivity. Now, this is a very complex idea. I'm just trying to illustrate this in this very simple way to show you that there's a third characteristic here which plays an important role in understanding economics and politics, and that's this idea of connectivity. The greater connectivity your manifold of action has, the greater potential it has for density of action. In the domain of economics, a simple analogy would be, think about what the connectivity of the United States was before and after the development of the transcontinental railroad. The connectivity of the East Coast to the West Coast was either all the way around South America or a trip down through the Gulf of Mexico to the Isthmus of Panama, transfer to land across the isthmus, transfer back to the boat, and then up the Pacific coast to California, versus the transcontinental railroad, which made a land connection. The same thing can be seen if you were to, and Putin alluded to this, by the way, not too explicitly, but he did allude to it in the interview he did with NBC TV of the Bering Strait, where the Alaska and the tip of Siberia come very close to each other, and it's quite feasible with existing technology to build a transport link across that area, which would then make, say, the trip, the transportation capability to Asia much shorter than it currently is by land, ship, land. So that changes the connectivity of the whole global economy. And we can develop all kinds of ideas about that. So you have these three characteristics. So you have to understand, when you're dealing with economic policy and when you're dealing with politics, political analysis and analysis of world events and historical events, that you have to be able to develop a fluency with these concepts: the manifold of action, the dimensionality of the manifold of action, that is, what are the principles that are actually determining the action, the curvature, which has a further defining characteristic, and thirdly, the connectivity. I've introduced these ideas really very quickly and very simply, but they're very deep ideas, and each one of them, really, to fully master them, takes a lot of time. But I can tell you that these were essential preconditions that LaRouche had in his mind and worked on all his life, and insisted that other people work on them, to develop the conceptual and intellectual tools to be able to understand what's going on in the world, analyze it, and navigate a path to the future. So I'll stop there for tonight, and hopefully we can have some discussion.